Hi, my name is Yuva, and I'm here today to talk about Testng Part 2. This Part 2 covers about data-driven testing, listeners, and parallelism. If you haven't watched Part 1, I suggest you do. So before proceeding further, let's take a quick recap of Part 1. So Part 1, we saw about writing test methods and configuration methods and also properly ordering it using the annotations as per the use case, followed by how you can group test cases with meaningful group names and adding dependencies between test cases, which can be a hard dependency or a soft dependency. And finally, listing out your tests and test classes inside a suite file and running the test suites. So these are some of the basic things which we saw in the part one. So let's get started with part two, data-driven testing. So we often come across a situation wherein a test or a use case needs to be iterated with different data sets. To put it in simple words, I need to run the same test method with different data. For example, let's take a calculator, and to test the addition feature, I need to pass different set of integers to the addition method and validate the test results. So this can be achieved using data-driven testing. So it's done by annotating the method with the data provider annotation. And this data can be supplied to the test method either in a sequential manner or in a parallel way. And whenever we pass a data to a test method, the testng expects certain parameters. It can be 1 to n number of parameters, or in a complex case, we can have all the parameters inside a Java class and pass the Java Pojo as a parameter, which we'll be seeing it in an example. So how it's done? First thing. So I need a method to read and supply the data and a test method which consumes the data. So if you see here, the data method has been annotated with at data provider with a meaningful name I supply data. And this sample test annotated with at test uses the data provider I supply data and it reads the data which is provided by the I give data method. Let's look at a more programmatical way. So this is my sample. The data provider method is called supply data, which returns an array of integers. The test method consumes the data provider I supply data. The test method has two parameters. So things to note here are the data provider should have a meaningful name, and the data provider method should return a two-dimensional object array. In some cases, Testng also provides the facility to return a iterator containing objects. And the next thing is to use the data provider and test method, you need to supply the data provider name and the parameters. If you take a closer look at this example, this supply data returns an integer array with two parameters, and I have equalized the same amount of parameters inside the test method. You may also want to try including one more parameter and run this case. Testng will throw an error saying it couldn't match the parameters. So let's have a practical demo. So the example which I'll be using here will be called the calculator DP test. DP stands for data provider test. So in this practical walkthrough, um, you'll be uh, listening about how to use data provider with simple arguments, passing data in a parallel way to the test method, and using the data provider with complex arguments. So this is just the example which you have seen in the slide, and So this is consumed. This data provider provides data to the test addition method. So I have another example to pass a complex type as a parameter. So for now, I'll just disable this and I'll run the test method. So this result is the output from calling the test addition method. And if you see here, all the test cases have passed. That is because I have not asserted anything, but you can add assertions as per the use case. And this testing has provided information saying that I've run this test addition method with the arguments from the data provider. And each data set will be counted as a test, and the number of tests run will be 4. Now, this particular test addition method has been supplied with the data in a sequential manner. What if I want the addition result to be in a parallel way? Then I need to add a flag called parallel flag and set it to true. The other parameter you see here for data provider is indices. So it allows you to pick specific indexes from the data provider. By default, it will take all the data. So let's go ahead and set this parallel to true. To give you a clear picture, I have printed the thread ID so that it is sure that Testng is running the each data set in a separate thread. So if you see the output, so Testng has spawned independent threads for each data and it has calculated the result. Although this output might provide an impression that um, both sequential and parallel seem to provide the same console output, which is why I printed the thread ID to make it sure that Testng is running this thing in a parallel way. So this is a if you just to reiterate, the same amount of parameters have been specified here in the test method. So what if the number of parameters grows and say I include a parameter here, and if I run the test script, okay, so I've used the same name. Let me call it as C2. So if I go ahead and run this test method, it says that data provider is trying to pass 2 parameters, but the method accepts 3 parameters. So whenever the parameters grows, I need to add it to the data provider as well as in the test method which consumes the data provider. Uh, let's take the test method now. So now we are going to use a complex data type, which means I'm going to create a simple class that will contain the list of parameters which will be used as an argument with the test method. So whenever a new parameter is added, it will be added to the particular class. It is just a plain old Java class. And whenever there is a new data added to the data provider, this will be solved using data providers which CLine provides, which we'll be seeing it later. So for now, I'll disable this test addition method and I'll enable this test addition with the complex data. So instead of just passing the data and reading it as a parameter here, I have put the parameters inside a sample class and I'm passing it through the data provider. So let's see what happens now. So now if you note closely, I've got the addition result printed here. Along with this, Testng has provided the name of the instance which it created and passed it to the test addition, which means Testng has created this instance and it has passed this particular values in a sequential manner to the test addition method. This way, it's easy to maintain the growing list of parameters. So let's move on to the next topic called the listeners. So listeners are interfaces provided by Testng to tap into its Testng behavior. So precisely, you can use this interface, which will be called by Testng at particular checkpoints and execute your method. So some of the listeners which I'll be showing in this demo will be iTest listener, iSuit listener, iConfiguration listener. There are other listeners provided by Testng, which can be found in the Testng documentation under testng.org/doc. So iTest listener is specific to a test and it provides methods such as onTest success, which is invoked when a test method is successful. OnTest failure is invoked whenever a test method fails. OnTest skipped is invoked whenever a test is skipped. iSuit listener is specific to a suit. So iSuit listener will invoke, Testng will invoke the onStart method uh, whenever the before launching the suit, and onFinish will be called after all the suits have completed its execution. This iConfiguration is specific to configuration methods, and it provides the same set of methods that we have just seen in the iTest listener. So as part of our demo, uh, there is a listener implemented in CLine. It's called a debug listener. So this debug listener implements listeners like iTest listener, iSuit listener, iConfiguration listener, which we just discussed now, and we implement all these methods. So what happens now is whenever we run a test case, this listener will be invoked by Testng and it will log a message to the console saying that this so and so test has passed, failed, or whatever message we have specified here. So let's now that we have seen what is a listener, there's an obvious question on how do I make Testng recognize my listeners. So it allows three ways of doing it. Uh, One is you can add the listeners under the listeners tag in the suite file, followed by using the service loader concept, will be which you can see it in the testing documentation, followed by using the listener annotation. So uh, this is my listener example containing two test methods, and I've specified the listener using the @listener annotation. Here I'll be invoking the debug listener. So let's see what happens if I run this test. So Testng will launch the test case, and whenever I'm running it using the Testng plugin from Eclipse, there will be a default suite and a default test. So before the suite gets started, the on start will be called, followed by on test start for the test named default test and the test method, and followed by the test method 2. So these output is from the listener, followed by default test finish, and finally the default suite finished. So this is just a primary example, um, you can use for um, debugging your test cases, and any specific purpose which you like Testng to attach to itself as per your test runs. So let's move on to one of the interesting topics in this Testng tutorial. It's about running tests in parallel. There often comes a situation wherein you just can't run test cases in a sequential way because it takes a lot of time. That is when TestNG is smart enough to give you the flexibility to choose the way in running your test cases in parallel. So it allows to run tests across multiple threads. So TestNG allows you to configure the parallelism uh, by allocating threads for each test, for each class, and for each method. So now the obvious question is, where do I configure TestNG to read the parameters for parallelism? It's using the parallel parameter inside the suite file. So there's going to be a practical walkthrough of configuring test to run parallelly uh, by spawning multiple threads for tests, individual classes inside a test tag, and individual methods inside classes. So this is going to be the suite file named cline sample test, which I'll be using it for demo purposes. So this is a parameter which I showed just now. I've added this as for illustration purpose. Actually, it just takes only one parameter. So let's delete that. Okay. So a couple of more parameters that helps in running or configuring to run tests in a parallel manner is the thread count, and the other parameter is data provided thread count. So the first thing, the thread count allows you to specify the number of threads that needs to be spawned uh, while executing the test cases. Again, this specific option will tie up with the parallel flag and spawn threads as per the requirement. The reason why I'm iterating the data provided thread count here is in the data provider section, when I ran a test in the demo, so I've enabled a flag called parallel equal to true with the data provider annotation, which allows the test ng to spawn individual thread for each data set that is supplied to a test method. So the number of thread count for that particular data provider can be configured using this parameter. So TestNG reads these parameters and deduces that how many threads it has to spawn for the data provider to supply data to the test method, and it will spawn that many threads and pass it to the test method. So this is just a knowledge tip for supplying data parallelly to a test method while using a data provider. Again, getting back to the concept of configuring our test to run parallelly. So the thread count allows you to specify the number of threads that needs to be spawned. So I have two classes called test class A and test class B. It contains it just contains test methods which prints out the test name and the thread ID. So let me run this. So what happens here is, okay, I've run some other test. So there are total number of tests run being 12, 4 plus per each class. Sorry, 3 per each class. So now I've printed the test method name, the test name, followed by the class name and the ID of the thread that is executing. Since I have set the parallel as false, the TestNG has spawned only one thread and it has executed all the test methods inside the test suite. So let's go one step further. The total number of thread count which I want to instruct TestNG is 5, and I want to spawn thread for each test. The test being not the at test which I specify for the test method, but the test tag over here. So let me run it one more time. So if you take a closer look at the output, now I've specified parallel as tests. So testng will spawn independent threads for each and every test method. Here I have only two IDs printed, 10 and 11, which is spawned for two tests named parallelism test 1 and parallelism test 2. So a single thread is spawned for the this test, and that thread will be used to run all the classes inside the particular test, and similarly for test parallelism test 2. Let's change this to classes. What happens now is testng will spawn individual threads for each and every class that is specified in the suite file, and it will execute the class in that particular thread. So here it is. Now I have four IDs, 10, 11, 12 and 13, which represents the four threads that has been spawned for four classes in my suite file. Let me change this to methods. Now it's obvious that the testng will spawn individual threads for each and every test method inside the test suite. So if you see here, I have 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So it has spawned separate threads for each and every test method inside the classes. Okay, so now I have specified the parallel flag at the suite level. There are some situations wherein not all the test needs to be run in parallel, but I want to choose it selectively as per my requirement, which means I need to specify the parallel flag at a test level inside a suite so that I can decide which test needs to be run parallelly. For example, I don't want parallelism test 2 to run parallelly, whereas I want the parallelism test 1 to run parallelly by allocating individual threads for each classes, which means all my classes inside the test name parallelism test 2 should be run with separate threads. Let me run this and see what happens. So if you take a closer look, whatever I have specified under parallelism test 2, the parallelism has been disabled, which states that testng overrides the value from the suite level and applies whatever is there that is given in the test tag. And for the test parallelism test 1, I've instructed testng to spawn individual threads for each classes. There are two classes, so it has spawned two threads, 10 with IDs 10 and 11. So this is one interesting way of by which testng allows you to override the parallel flag and run it as per the need. Okay, let's have a checkpoint here. Write a sample test method with a data provider, specify it in a suite file, and change this data provider thread count and see what happens. So that's all about running tests in parallel. Thank you for watching. I hope the video Testng Part 2 is helpful to know the basics of data providers, listeners, and parallelism. If you have any questions or doubts, please post it to our forum, C Line forum. Thank you.